Some years ago, a little boy who lived in the country with his parents in a home that had no plumbing meant that he had to use the outhouse by the creek. He hated having to do that. One day in his frustration, he pushed the small outhouse into the creek. His father came to him later that day and said, "Son, did you push the outhouse into the creek?" He said, "Yes, Dad, I did." "Well, son, I'm gonna have to discipline you for doing that." But the son protested. He said, "But wait a minute, Dad. George Washington's father asked him, did he chop down the cherry tree? And George Washington told the truth and was rewarded for telling the truth." That's when the father said, "Yeah, but George Washington's father wasn't in the cherry tree. So Daddy was in the outhouse when he got pushed into the creek." You know, decisions matter. And you make the wrong decision at the wrong time, and yeah, there are consequences. Choices matter. That's why you want to live a life of wisdom, which has to do with making the right decision. And the way you know to make the right decision is that you learn to live by faith in who God is and what God says, not just in what you think and how you feel at a given time. In this next exhibit, we want to review the life of a man who made a choice, Moses, the great leader of Israel. He had to make a choice, and it was a life-altering decision. In Hebrews chapter 11, we read in verse 23, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." Moses lived at a time of infanticide and slavery and oppression as God's people were in Egypt. He lived in a time that was not socially acceptable for God's people to exist in, yet it was their reality. Yet in the worst of times, Moses' parents made a choice because they saw something. He was a beautiful child. Now, that's not just talking about how cute he was in the crib. When you look at Acts chapter 7, it talks about him, beginning in verse 20, as being lovely in the sight of God. In other words, they saw that God had a divine plan for this baby. That's a word for parents. When you're choosing and guiding your children, you want to look at the spiritual purpose, not only the human existence. And when they saw that God was involved with the birth and development of their child, they were not going to subject themselves to the social structures of the day. Because sometimes you're going to have to choose. Do you go with what society has made convenient and authorized, even legally, or will you go with God? So they came up with a plan, because when you choose to go with God, he'll give you a plan. If you're not sure you want to go with God, then you will not get the illumination of the plan God wants you to execute. And you know the story, that when the plan was made and he's going down the Nile and Pharaoh's daughter sees him and picks him up, and he's raised in Pharaoh's home. It goes on to say, "And by faith," verse 24, "when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather," his choice again, "to endure ill treatment with the people of God rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin." Listen to this. "Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." Moses' choice is your choice if you're going to be a kingdom hero. When he was 40 years old, he made a decision. Acts chapter 7 says, to publicly go with God rather than to go with culture, even though it would go against the living large environment he had been raised in. I mean, he was raised with a silver spoon in his mouth, but his mother, being his nursemaid, kept influencing him about his true identity. as a Hebrew and as belonging to the covenant of God. And at 40 years old, he decided that he was no longer going to go both ways. Sometimes recognizing his identity as a Hebrew, other times basking in the benefits of being in Pharaoh's household. He decided to make a choice Godward. Every Christian faces this. We're even told that he decided to identify with the reproach of Christ, and this is in the Old Testament. So here's what I want to ask you. Have you made the decision to no longer be an undefined voter? That you're standing flat-footed in midair? That you're no longer going to be identified sometimes as a follower of Christ and sometimes as comfortable in the culture? Moses made a decision. He chose, and let's look at his choice a little deeper. It involved a couple of things. His first choice was that he would suffer the reproach of Christ, that is, the consequences of being identified with his faith. Far too many Christians are unwilling to be identified as a Christian outside of their convenient Christian environment. Yeah, you'll do it at church or at Bible study with small group. But what about at work? If you were accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you, or would you be found innocent of all charges? And we're not talking about because you're doing wrong. We're talking about because you don't mind being identified. Paul put it this way in Galatians 2:20, I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I. It's Christ who lives in me. The life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Christ is my new identity. In other words, I will suffer the reproach of Christ when it conflicts with my racial identity. I will suffer the reproach of Christ when it conflicts with my cultural or class identity or gender identity. I will suffer the repercussions of what it means to be overtly Christian. I'm going to do it in love, and I'm going to do it with sensitivity, but I'm going to do it with clarity. The second thing is that he decided to no longer roll with the passing pleasures of sin. He says a couple things about sin. It's pleasurable. We wouldn't do it if we didn't enjoy it. He also says it's passing. That is, it's seasonal. It's there for the moment, but it can go left on you real quick. And we see that when people have to pay the price. And we all have at various levels at various times for our sin. He says, I will suffer because of my identity within Christ to overrule anything else in my life. And I choose to please God, not to please self. And why did he do it? He says, because he was looking for the reward. Now, I've got some good news for you. And the good news is there is a payoff to choosing Christ. There is a negative to choosing Christ. Paul calls it in Philippians 3, the fellowship of his suffering. So there is a negative. You lose out on some things when you choose to be identified as a visible, verbal, full-time Christian, not part-time saint. But there is with that negative a positive. The positive is the reward. God is going to reward those believers, kingdom heroes, who decide that they don't mind being identified with him, saying no to the culture and no to the unrighteousness, and saying, I choose to follow Jesus Christ. There is going to be a reward. Some of it comes in time, the bulk of it comes in eternity. I remember when my wife was passing from time into eternity, and one of those rich segments in that difficult season was her looking up to the ceiling and saying, they want to give me my reward. They're just waiting for the song. And then the song Victory in Jesus came on, some music we were playing. And she said, that's the song. They're ready to give me my reward. There is a reward to choosing Christ. There are negatives when you go against what people think, what the culture says, what's popular. But when you look to Christ and look to the reward. God doesn't mind you wanting the reward. This is not talking about going to heaven. This is talking about the reward for being a kingdom hero on earth and being in God's museum because you chose him. So choose wisely. Choose Christ like Moses did so that you get his help on earth and your great reward in the life to come.